The rule of Darius, the third great ruler of the Persian Empire, was to last 36 years from 522 to 486 BCE. He inherited a huge empire. No king before him had had to manage so many people spread across such a large spread of territory and of so many cultures. Darius instituted some key administrative changes that consolidated the empire. He divided the massive landmass into 20 satrapies or provinces. Each of them was as large as a kingdom, with its satraps having full authority to quash rebellion. In order to prevent the satraps from rising against the central empire, Darius ensured that all tax collectors, military officials, and treasury officials in each of the satrapies reported directly to the central government. He also placed agents who were referred to as the king's ears in each satrapy. These men were highly feared as they made the rounds of all the royal courts. A major challenge for such a large empire was communication. With such vast distances, it could take more than a year to get a message from the capital to the far-flung reaches of the empire. Darius met the challenge by setting up troops of messengers on fast horses with relay stations dotted across the territory. A rider would gallop all day, changing horses at each station. When he was too exhausted to continue, he would hand off the message to the next rider. This was an ancient version of the Pony Express system that was used in the American West in 1860. A system of roads was built by the Persians to expedite travel across the kingdom. One of the most prominent was the King's Highway, which had more than 100 way stations with fresh horses, inns for travelers, and patrols to defend against attack by bandits. The King's Highway stretched for more than 1,500 miles from Susa, the Persian capital, west to Sardis, in what is now Turkey. A message carried along this highway could get from Sardis to Susa in just a week. Darius spent the first 4 years of his rule consolidating his power. Then, in 518, he conquered the northern Punjab area of India. 5 years later, he launched an invasion of European Scythia. The Scythians, however, proved to be an elusive enemy. They retreated to the east as the Persians chased them down, using feints and hit-and-run tactics to frustrate Darius's army. This drew the Persian forces deep into Scythian lands. The frustrated Persian general demanded that the Scythians stand and fight, but they refused to do so. Sickness and lack of provisions eventually caused the Persians to give up and head home. On the return trip, the Persians brought the Greek cities of Thrace, Macedonia, Ionia, and the Aegean Islands under their dominion. Between 499 and 493, however, a series of revolts erupted through these Greek-speaking areas. The biggest rebellion broke out in Ionia. The Persians were ruthless in crushing the unrest, and a peace settlement was imposed in 493. The Ionian Revolt was the first phase of the Greco-Persian War. The revolt had been supported by Athens and Eritrea, and Darius was determined to make them pay. This motivated him to take on a campaign of conquest against all of Greece. In 492 BCE, the Persian general Mardonius reimposed Persian control over Thrace and Macedon. Then, 2 years later, the Athenian and Persian armies clashed at the Greek town of Marathon. Although greatly outnumbered, the superior tactics of the Athenian general Miltiades saw his army enveloping and routing the Persians. Darius's army broke into a blind panic, with many of them being slaughtered as they desperately tried to make it back to their ships, which lay in anchor several miles from the battle site. Darius immediately set about rebuilding his army for a renewed assault on the Athenians. He was sidetracked, however, by a revolt in Egypt in 486. Before he could deal with either issue, Darius died. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Xerxes, who was determined to carry out the job of conquering the Greeks. He built up a massive army, entering Greece from the north in the spring of 480 BCE. the Persians were able to advance through Macedonia and Thessaly without resistance. However, they were met by a small Greek force which delayed them at Thermopylae for 3 days. At the same time, a naval battle was taking place at Artemisium. The Persians won both encounters, with the naval victory giving them open access to the Aegean Sea. Xerxes next moved on to Athens. Finding the city evacuated, he ordered his troops to sack it. Not long after, however, the Greeks won a decisive naval victory at the Battle of Salamis. Xerxes was forced to pull back to Sardis. He left a small force behind, which retook Athens, but was then defeated at the Battle of Platae in 479. This, along with another defeat at Mycale, inspired the Greek cities in Asia Minor to revolt once again. The Persians were unable to regain control, losing all of their European conquests. In August 465 BCE, Xerxes was assassinated by the commander of his royal bodyguard, a man named Artabanus. He also killed the heir to the throne, Xerxes' eldest son Darius, but then another of Xerxes' sons, Artaxerxes, killed Artabanus and assumed the kingship for himself. His 45-year reign was a period of relative peace for the empire, interrupted by ongoing battles with the Spartans and an Egyptian revolt in 373. Artaxerxes was unable to reclaim Egypt. He died in 368 BCE and was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes III. By now, the weakened empire was seeing rebellion breaking out in one place after another. Trade, and therefore tax collection, faltered, resulting in higher taxes and a more repressive government. This, in turn, led to even more rebellion. By the time that Alexander the Great of Macedonia invaded in 334, Persia was a weakened shadow of its former self. At the head of a small but very capable army, Alexander managed to conquer Persia, systematically destroying its armies one by one. By 331, the Persian Empire had been swallowed up by Alexander. The great empire that had been founded by Cyrus the Great was no more. Persia, however, was destined to rise from the ashes. Around 200 CE, it re-emerged as the Sassanid kingdom, lasting for another 450 years, until it was conquered by the Arab armies of Islam.